"You brought nothing but misery into this family," my mother would tell me in a cold, ringing voice, when, as a small child, I accidentally broke a cup or simply allowed myself a loud, childish laugh in the yard. "You must remember every single second what a terrible sacrifice it is to raise you, feed you, dress you, and pretend that everything is fine. If you knew what I had to go through on that cursed day, you would never in your life dare even to smile on August 12th. My name is Sierra, and I am 25 years old. My birthday has always been a quiet, almost funereal affair. While other children at school boasted of balloons, funny animators in bright costumes, mountains of rustling gifts, and sweet birthday cakes decorated with multicolored candles, I always tried to pretend that the 12th of August was just the most ordinary, gray, unremarkable day on the calendar. I would tightly button the collar of my jacket up to my chin, cast my eyes low toward the cracked asphalt of the schoolyard, and dream of only one thing: that none of my classmates would accidentally remember this date, start up a chorus of "Happy Birthday to you," or ask unnecessary questions to which I had no answers. Welcome to the Storytime Drama Channel, a territory where other people's skeletons in the closet come to light. We dive into real stories about shattered trust and retribution that no one expected. Take a break from the endless hustle and bustle, pour your favorite drink, and let's begin. My mother, I always mentally called her Gwendolyn, though in early childhood I tried to call her a tender mom, but very quickly broke myself of that warm word through harsh shouts and cold silence, would practically evaporate from the space of our large but uncomfortable apartment on this day. She would lock herself in her bedroom, pulling heavy velvet curtains tightly shut. I remember myself as a 7-year-old girl, sitting alone on the cold kitchen linoleum, while muffled, wrenching, frightening sobs came from behind the tightly closed, massive door of my parents' bedroom. I knew the unspoken rules of this house by heart, having learned them better than any school multiplication table. On this day, making noise was strictly forbidden. No breathing loudly, no turning on the television, listening to music, or walking through the apartment too quickly. You couldn't even approach the mirror and smile at your reflection, because any displayed joy or spontaneous child's laughter was perceived in our house as a personal insult, a cynical spit in the face of a person who was suffering for two. I grew up with this unbearable, suffocating weight of guilt that pressed on my shoulders from early morning until deep into the night. I sincerely believed that I was some fundamental error of nature, a genetic glitch, the living embodiment of someone's malicious will and catastrophe. My life, according to Gwendolyn, cost my mother her own happiness, her health, her youth, and all her hopes. I was a quiet, unnoticed, almost transparent shadow in the long corridors of our house. At school, people avoided me because I always looked hunted, frightened, and tense, and at home I tried not to catch anyone's eye at all, dissolving into corners. My father, Franklin, existed in this house with the status of a voiceless ghost. He worked as an engineer at an old factory on the edge of town, leaving early in the morning while we were still sleeping in the cold twilight, and returning late at night when I was already sitting over my textbooks in the absolute silence of my room. I remember his rare, timid attempts to protect me. When I was 10 years old, I accidentally brushed the sleeve of my sweater against her favorite porcelain cup standing on the edge of the table. The cup crashed to the floor with a ring and shattered into hundreds of small fragments. I froze, waiting for the worst, and burst into tears. Gwendolyn then choked with anger, her face twisted into a gruesome grimace, and she sharply swung her hand at me. Franklin, unexpectedly for everyone, intercepted her wrist in midair. "Gwen, stop it for God's sake, she's just a child, it's just dishes!" he shouted for the first time in his life so loudly that my ears popped. What followed that display of rebellion, I will not forget for the rest of my days. Gwendolyn did not start a fight or scream back. She looked at him with such a cold, murderous gaze that the lips of a grown, strong man trembled. She turned around, silently walked to her bedroom, and locked herself in. And she didn't come out for 3 whole days. She didn't cook food, didn't turn on the lights, completely plunging our house into an icy vacuum of alienation. Franklin broke on the second day of this psychological torture. I saw through the crack in the door how he knelt in front of her locked door, humiliatingly begging for forgiveness for daring to raise his voice at her and protect his own child. Since then, he never, not a single time, intervened again. He looked at me with endless, heavy, leaden pity, which read a mute but distinct reproach. Why were you born, and why did you bring this endless chaos into our house? And now I had turned 25, an age that is generally considered the official start of conscious, independent adult life. But for me, it was just another milestone of grief, another anniversary of mourning that I was used to experiencing in absolute solitude, locked in my room. A couple of days before this eerie date, Gwendolyn suddenly felt ill. A sharp blood pressure spike, a severe panic attack, the howl of an ambulance siren in our courtyard, the bustle of doctors with suitcases, and anxious packing. The doctors insisted on immediate hospitalization in the cardiology department of the regional hospital, prescribing strict bed rest, complete peace, and isolation from any stress for at least a whole week. When the heavy door of the ambulance slammed shut behind her, our huge house, for the first time in 25 years, fell into absolute, ringing, physically palpable silence. There was no heavy, oppressive presence of hers in the living room, no judging glance in my back, no heavy, demonstrative sighs that made the air in the rooms feel thick, sticky, and unfit for breathing. Left completely alone in the empty house, for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange, almost criminal relief. It was like a person who, having been in shackles for a long time, suddenly feels them loosen slightly. I walked from room to room, dusted, sorted through things that had accumulated over months, and at some point, my hands reached the old mezzanine located at the very end of the dark hallway. No one had looked up there for 15 years, if not more. Heavy boxes with yellowed photo albums, old Soviet tableware, some unnecessary receipts, shoeboxes, and old magazines were piled up on top. I dragged a wobbly wooden chair from the kitchen, placed it right under the mezzanine opening, carefully climbed up, and reached for the very far, dust-covered velvet corner of the upper shelf. My fingers felt a heavy cardboard box buried under a thick, velvety layer of gray dust. When I pulled it toward me with effort, a dense, time-yellowed A4 envelope slipped from its bottom and fell right onto my lap. I jumped off the chair onto the parquet, coughing slightly from the rising cloud of dust, and instinctively turned the envelope face up. A wave of icy, paralyzing tremor rolled through my body instantly, from head to toe. My last name and first name were written on the envelope in Gwendolyn's perfect, painfully familiar calligraphic handwriting. But below was a postscript made in bold ink, at which all my insides collapsed. To Sierra, personally into hands, open only after my coming of age. If you open it earlier, you will single-handedly destroy everything I built for the sake of your salvation. The paper was sealed tightly with an old burgundy sealing wax seal that had cracked at the edges over time and was covered in micro-cracks. I sat right on the cold hallway parquet, pressing this ominous envelope to my chest, feeling the insane, rhythmic beating of my heart echo in my fingertips and ring in my ears. I intuitively understood that something monstrous was hidden behind this envelope, capable of erasing my entire past life in a single second and turning it to ashes. But I could no longer stop. Rolling back with my back against the wall of the dark hallway, I froze with the heavy envelope in my trembling hands. The air in the apartment felt unbearably thick and stale. It smelled of old paper, stale dust, and something elusively alien, frightening. I was still desperately clinging to a tiny hope that some banal misunderstanding would turn out to be inside. Maybe it was a stupid family secret, an ordinary, bland melodrama about distant relatives I had never been told about, or some strange inheritance that Gwendolyn decided to present with excessive, almost theatrical theatricality. My mother simply adored dramas. Our whole life was built on her endless emotional swings, on her manipulations, on her despotic demands for absolute submission and eternal gratitude for deigning to release me into this cruel world. I mentally returned to my childhood, trying to find even a glimmer of warmth, but found only icy voids. My past practically lacked those bright memories that are usually carefully kept in memory and carried through life. Most children remember fun family trips to the amusement park with parents, eating sticky cotton candy, the sincere laughter of fathers throwing them up to the skies, and the soft, warm hands of mothers carefully healing bruised knees with brilliant green and soothing kisses. My personal arsenal of childhood memories consisted of frighteningly quiet rooms in our large apartment, endless prohibitions, sidelong glances, and sticky, all-consuming fear of doing something wrong, of crossing the invisible line of what is permitted. Gwendolyn never shouted in a bass voice, never threw drunken rows, or raised her hands the way it is often shown in marginal families on television. Her methods of psychological violence were much more sophisticated, subtle, and destructive. She methodically destroyed me drop by drop, using absolute silence, cold ignore, and a suffocating sense of guilt as her main weapons. Every year, when August 12th inevitably arrived on the calendar, a state of emergency was declared in our house. Heavy curtains were lowered onto the windows, completely cutting off the path of sunlight. The television, radio, and any sound sources were turned off under threat of inevitable punishment. I sat in my room, scared to death, afraid to even breathe too loudly, because I knew for sure. Behind the thin wall sat a woman who was deeply unhappy solely because of my appearance into the world. If it weren't for you, my life would have turned out completely differently. These words echoed in my head with frightening, mechanical regularity, carved onto my heart with a sharp chisel. You took away everything most valuable I had. You must eternally redeem this guilt before my broken heart. I grew up with the absolute, rock-solid conviction that I was some fundamental error of nature, unnecessary ballast, a parasite that had drunk all life juices from its own mother. During my school years, I avoided peers, unable and not daring to make normal friends. Any manifestation of sincere sympathy or friendly interest from classmates caused me panic horror, because I was devoutly sure that a person, getting to know me better, would certainly be disappointed and understand what an absolute nothing I really was. Boys seemed like inhabitants of unattainable planets to me, and teachers, merciless judges pronouncing the final verdict. I studied exclusively straight A's, not because I felt a passion for knowledge, but because it was the only legal way to earn her skimpy, icy praise, resembling a handout from a master's table. "Well, at least there is some minor use from you in studies," she would throw at me, studying the school report card with grades, while my heart shrank from humiliation and pain. My father, Franklin, existed in this gloomy house with the status of a voiceless ghost. He worked as an engineer at a factory, leaving early in the morning when we were still sleeping in the twilight, and returning late at night when I was already sitting over textbooks in the absolute silence of my room. I remember his rare, timid attempts to protect me from her anger. When I turned 10 years old, I accidentally brushed the sleeve of my sweater against her favorite porcelain cup standing on the edge of the table. The cup crashed to the floor with a ring and shattered into hundreds of sharp fragments. I froze, waiting for the worst, and burst into tears. Gwendolyn then choked with anger, her face twisted into a creepy grimace, and she sharply swung her hand at me. Franklin, unexpectedly for everyone, intercepted her wrist in midair. "Gwen, stop it for God's sake! She's just a child! It's just dishes!" He shouted for the first time in his life so loudly that my ears popped. What followed that display of rebellion I will not forget for the rest of my days. Gwendolyn did not start a fight or scream back. She looked at him with such a cold, murderous gaze that the lips of a grown, strong man trembled. She turned around, silently walked to her bedroom, and locked herself in. And she didn't come out for 3 whole days. She didn't cook food, didn't turn on the lights, completely plunging our house into an icy vacuum of alienation. Franklin broke on the 2nd day of this psychological torture. I saw through the crack in the door how he knelt in front of her locked door, humiliatingly begging for forgiveness for daring to raise his voice at her and protect his own child. Since then, he never, not a single time, intervened again. He looked at me with endless, heavy, leaden pity, which read a mute but distinct reproach. "Why were you born? And why did you bring this endless chaos into our house?" Sitting on the cold hallway floor with the old envelope in my hands, I clearly realized all the monstrous absurdity of this picture. 25 years of building a thick defense against non-existent sins. 25 years of continuous self-flagellation. With effort, I pushed these heavy memories back into the depths of my consciousness, and with trembling, sweaty fingers, neatly tore open the edge of the paper. It was time to find out what exactly was hidden behind this long-term theatrical tragedy. The first sheet of thick paper was written in Gwendolyn's smooth, flawless handwriting, but closer to the middle of the page, the letters began to curve slightly, giving away the strong excitement of a person pouring out onto paper what they had carried under their heart for decades, sealed tightly in the vaults of their perverted psyche. I brought the paper closer to the dim light of the desk lamp, coming from the open door of the living room, and began reading the lines, feeling how with every new word the ground rapidly slipped away from under my feet, and the familiar world crumbled into small, sharp fragments that could no longer be glued together. My fingers, which until that moment had tightly squeezed the edges of the yellowed sheet, trembled with such force that the paper rustled like a frightened bird. At that moment, it seemed to me as if the very fabric of time around me had thinned, opening a gaping void. Sierra, if you are reading these lines, it means I am no longer around, or that terrible day has come when you finally managed to break through the walls I erected around you your whole conscious life. Forgive me? No, I don't even dare ask for your forgiveness. It is simply impossible to forgive such a thing. I understand that perfectly. You have every legal and moral right to hate me more than you hated your own birthday all these long years. But you are obliged to know the whole truth, no matter how repulsive, frightening, and unbearable it may seem to you. 30 years ago, I was expecting a child. It was my first, long-awaited pregnancy, suffered through years of infertility, endless doctor visits, bitter tears into the pillow, and hundreds of pills taken. Franklin carried me in his arms, surrounding me with incredible care. We prayed for the appearance of this baby into the world. We prepared for the appearance of our daughter with a tremor that is painful to remember now. We whitewashed the ceilings in the future nursery ourselves, picked pastel-colored hand-sewn curtains, bought tiny undershirts made of the softest cotton, lace caps, and the first branded rattles that fell onto the carpet with a quiet, joyful ring. But on the very day of birth, an irreparable, terrible catastrophe occurred, dividing my life into before and after. My little girl was born dead. The intensive care doctors fought for her for several hours, used defibrillators, injected adrenaline directly into the heart, but it was too late. Her tiny, not yet having time to properly know life heart stopped forever, even before birth. When I came to in a sterile hospital delivery room flooded with cold light, the entire universal world around me simply collapsed into a black, bottomless abyss. In the neighboring room, there was absolute, ominous silence, interspersed with my own frantic, torn cries of despair, which the staff tried to muffle with hoarse doses of sedatives. The emptiness in my chest was so physically palpable, heavy, and suffocating that it felt as if I had been gutted alive myself with a rusty, blunt knife, leaving me bleeding on the operating table. On that fateful evening, I wandered aimlessly, like a somnambulist, through endless, winding hospital corridors in a state of complete affective shock, having completely lost my mind from grief, shock, and mental blindness. In a room nearby, in the furthest and quietest wing of the building, lay a young woman exhausted by difficult, prolonged, and agonizing labor, who had fallen into a deep, death-like sleep under the influence of strong narcotic drugs. Right next to her bed, in a transparent plastic crib with a tag, a newborn baby girl was sleeping peacefully. It was you. You were completely alive, warm, pink. You breathed with a full chest, making quiet, serene sounds symbolizing pure, unclouded life. In my sick, crazed head from irreparable loss, a monstrous, irresistible, diabolical thought was instantly born. The universe acted monstrously unfairly. Why did it take my own child and leave this unfamiliar woman with such colossal, undeserved happiness? The on-duty doctor, a young intern who had accumulated huge, unbearable study debts, idiot loans, and a panic, animal fear of any professional responsibility, lawsuits, and loss of license, accidentally happened to cross my path in that deserted corridor. I still don't know with what terrible words, threats, or desperate promises I managed to break his weak resistance in just a few minutes. I promised him to give away absolutely all our family savings, sell our old dacha plot, any money in this world, get into bondage, just to help me pull off this madness. I cynically convinced him that I had given birth to a dead baby girl of exactly the same health, whom corrupt killer doctors supposedly swapped or hid to cover up a medical error. That dark night, we pulled off this absolute madness. I unhinderedly took you from the room, wrapped you in someone else's blanket, changed you into pre-prepared clothes of my dead child, and that frightened, trembling intern processed all the hospital medical documents as if you were born in another room and were immediately officially handed over to me. Franklin knew absolutely nothing. He was waiting for me at home, wondering if I was on an IV. When I returned home with you in my arms, he cried with happiness, kissing my hands, sincerely thinking that a real Christmas miracle had happened. I didn't dare tell him the truth right away, and when weeks, months, and years passed, it was already too late. The lie took such deep, ugly roots that confessing meant destroying the entire built structure to its very foundation. I sat on the floor in the semi-darkness of the corridor, completely numb, stunned, as if after a powerful explosion, unable to utter a single sound outward. There was such thick, ringing silence in the apartment that you could hear rare drops of autumn rain beating rhythmically and indifferently against the windowsill outside, counting down the seconds of my destroyed past life. Every read paragraph of this terrible letter acted like a blow of a red-hot whip, stripping away the familiar reality layer by layer, exposing the burning, bleeding truth from which it was impossible to hide. I reread paragraph after paragraph over and over, peering into every rounded letter, trying to convince myself with all my might that this was some kind of malicious prank, someone's clumsy mystification, a prolonged psychosis of an aging, lonely woman. But the handwriting remained too recognizable, too methodical. Every letter breathed that exact same manic neatness with which Gwendolyn forced me to rewrite school rules 5 times if the word contained even the slightest smudge or hint of carelessness. The realization that my real biological mother had walked this earth all these years, bitterly mourning me, beating down the thresholds of instances and looking for me day after day while I grew up in a golden cage next to a woman who secretly and methodically hated me for my own birthday, pierced me with a sharp, unbearable physical pain in my chest. All my childhood suppressed grievances, endless tears into the pillow to the howling of the wind outside the window, panic, paralyzing fear of August 12th, all this finally found a creepy, logical, exhaustive explanation. I was not just a foreign child in a strange house. I was a walking monument to someone else's crime, a living trophy tied to her bed by heavy chains of blackmail, psychological terror, and panic fear of inevitable exposure. I slowly caught my heavy breath, trying to cope with the burning nausea rising to my throat, wiped the cold sweat from my forehead with the back of a trembling palm, and with numb fingers, turned over the sheet of paper filled to the very end, getting ready to plunge into the next chapter of this hopeless nightmare where the past was supposed to finally and irrevocably collide with the present. I slowly, as if through a dense, suffocating thickness of water or thick leaden fog, turned over the written sheet with a trembling, icy hand. Large, cold sweat rolled down my face like hail, flooding my eyes, blurring my vision and leaving a bitter, disgusting taste of salt and panic on my cracked lips. At the bottom of the battered cardboard envelope, there were still some dense, time-yellowed papers, newspaper clippings crumbling at the edges, fastened with a rusty paperclip eaten into the fibers, and several old Polaroid photographs faded from long storage in the dark. I pulled them out with trembling fingers, not taking my inflamed, tear-reddened eyes from my mother's terrible handwriting. Now these neat, once seemingly exemplary calligraphic letters ceased to be a symbol of order and strictness. They turned into the handwriting of a cold-blooded, calculating, ruthless serial killer who masterfully disguised herself as a law-abiding, respected citizen in our small provincial town. With trembling hands, I laid out these creepy clippings right on the dusty parquet of the corridor. From the black and white newspaper pages of 30 years ago, exhausted, grief-stricken, despair-blackened faces of a young man and woman looked at me. The headlines shouted in large, bold print, "Unprecedented abduction from the maternity ward." Grieving parents announce a huge reward for any reliable information about the missing newborn baby girl. But as soon as I shifted my gaze to the neighboring articles, dated exactly 3 years later, my blood finally froze in my veins, turning into icy crystals. A family that survived a monstrous tragedy of the firstborn's abduction is deprived of parental rights to their younger son due to serious, irrefutable accusations of an antisocial lifestyle and domestic degradation, declared the dry, official font of the local crime chronicle. The higher court completely rejected the appeal of the spouses accused of flagrant domestic negligence, systematic drunkenness, and the use of prohibited synthetic substances. The minor child was seized by state services. My hands were shaking with such wild, uncontrollable force that I could barely focus my blurring gaze on the next sheet of Gwendolyn's sadistic confession. Do you think, Sierra, that the whole terrible nightmare ended with this? Gwendolyn continued to write mercilessly, and in every word of hers there wasn't a single drop of repentance, only proud, perverted self-admiration for her diabolical inventiveness. If everything were as simple as in cheap novels, the first 3 years of our life together, we lived as if in paradise, locked in our cozy cocoon. You grew up healthy, obedient, incredibly beautiful, and an ideal girl. But your biological parents turned out to be abnormally, frighteningly stubborn. They did not stop their searches for a single long day. They did not resign themselves to the loss, as most weak people do. They put the entire local police on their ears, involved the best independent private detectives, spending all their last savings on them, connected the press, radio, and regional television. They pasted orientation sheets with my and your assumed face on every pole and bulletin board. And one fine day, flooded with blinding summer sun, they finally came right onto our trail. I clearly remember that terrible day down to the smallest, creepy details that forever cut into the retina of my eyes. It was the end of July. A suffocating heat wave was melting the asphalt. I was calmly washing dishes in the kitchen, accidentally glanced out the window, and suddenly saw a young couple at our forged garden gates. They stood absolutely lost, haggard, beaten to death by endless sleepless nights and grief. In his hands, the man convulsively, with turned white fingers, squeezed those very old Polaroid photographs of the newborn baby girl stolen from them. And you, at that very moment, were carelessly sitting right in the middle of the yard, in your new plastic sandbox, in a light, open calico sundress, and enthusiastically molding sandcastles out of damp sand. The woman suddenly screamed so piercingly, wildly, and wrenchingly that this unnatural sound still rings deep in my ears. They recognized you. They recognized you by that rare birthmark on your left shoulder, which has the shape of a neat crescent. The exact same unique genetic sign belonged to Quentin, your real father. They instantly broke through the unlocked wicket, rushed straight to our porch, beating their fists wildly against the massive door, tearing their skin bloody, bitterly crying and begging us to open the door, to give them back their stolen flesh and blood. Franklin was at home at that moment. He had a rare, long-awaited day off. He heard their desperate, heart-rending cries through the closed front door, looked out the window in fright, saw their pale faces, and turned as white as a sheet himself, covered in cold, sticky sweat. In a panic, choking with animal terror of prison, he ran to me in the kitchen, grabbed my shoulders, and screamed in a voice not his own. "It's over, Gwen! They found us! We need to immediately open this damn door, give the child back, and surrender to the police before we are locked away for 2 decades in a federal prison." He was completely ready to break from his place, rush to the exit, fall to his knees before them, and confess wholeheartedly to everything. But I physically, mentally, could not allow this. The very thought that a child would be taken away from me again, for the second time in my life, the only living creature on earth that filled the black, gaping hole in my chest after the death of my baby, drove me completely and irrevocably mad. A primitive, animal instinct for survival at any cost awoke in me. Without thinking, I hit Franklin over the head with a heavy cast-iron skillet, not to death, but hard enough for him to lose orientation and collapse to the floor, forcefully pushing his limp body into a dark pantry under the stairs and sharply turning the key in the lock. Amidst his muffled, frightened sobs and blows to the door from the inside, I stood in the center of an empty corridor and coldly developed a diabolical, flawless plan that was supposed to once and for all destroy those people so that they would lose even the slightest desire to approach our house on the level of basic animal instincts. I closed my mouth with both hands in absolute terror, holding back a piercing scream tearing from the inside and trying to suppress a suffocating vomiting urge rising to my throat. My heart was beating wildly somewhere near my teeth, cutting off oxygen and preventing me from taking a full breath. So this weak, broken man, my so-called father, really tried to stop everything at that fateful moment? But he turned out to be infinitely weak in the face of her insane, destructive will. I used all my hidden connections, raised old acquaintances, withdrew absolutely all family money from accounts that we had been saving for you for university for years, and put all my black, concentrated anger into this crushing blow. I read further, feeling my blood freeze in my veins from every word of this methodical plan of revenge. I generously bribed a couple of unprincipled, debt-ridden policemen from the local precinct and one unscrupulous social worker. It cost colossal money, but the result was worth it. We methodically planted fake evidence right in their modest house. Empty bottles of cheap surrogate alcohol, scattered powders, traces of suspicious synthetic substances right by the crib. We fabricated dozens of fake collective complaints from supposedly indignant neighbors about constant night drunken orgies, fights, and direct threats to children's safety. We did everything possible so that the state punitive machine of guardianship agencies and the judicial system fell upon their fragile, injured psyche with all its leaden weight. Through bought courts, they were officially accused of being complete marginals, dangerous drug addicts, and insane psychopaths who, against the background of losing their first child, developed a severe form of schizophrenia and persecution mania. Their younger boy, who was barely 2 years old at the time, was brutally seized by cynical guardianship agencies right from the kindergarten group while the parents were at work. I personally stood aside on the neighboring street and gloatingly watched social inspectors shove the crying, frightened toddler into an official car while his mother fought in hysterics on the dusty asphalt, handcuffed by the arriving police. I single-handedly destroyed their life, Sierra. I destroyed someone else's family to the ground, ground them into bloody powder just to protect my criminal secret. Those unfortunate people simply had no physical, moral strength, or financial resources left to fight for you, because they spent days on end desperately trying to save their second son from the orphanage and prove their elementary sanity to the system. And my multi-year, exhausting hatred for your birthday. Oh, now you will fully understand its true, perverted nature. It was not mourning for the past at all. It was incessant, paralyzing, maddening terror of inevitable retribution. Every year, when August 12th arrived on the calendar, I clearly remembered those unfortunate people on our sun-drenched porch, their tear-stained faces pressed against the wicket bars, and I knew for sure that the truth could surface at any second. My tears on this day, my locked doors, and tightly drawn heavy curtains, it was an animal fear of inevitable retribution. And believe my word, they still know very well where we live. I personally happened to see them in the center of town last summer. They have aged greatly. Hunched over, thick gray hair has appeared in their hair, but they are still alive, and they remember you every second of their cursed existence. The letter abruptly cut off in the middle of a sentence. The last line was written crookedly, letters ugly sliding down, ink blurred, and the metal pen nib pierced the thick paper straight through, as if the author's hand had suddenly trembled violently at that moment from rushing memories, or someone had unexpectedly broken into the room with force, interrupting this sadistic confession. I sat on the hard, icy floor among thick dust, scattered Polaroid photographs, fabricated newspaper clippings, and heaps of paper trash. My breathing was intermittent, heavy. I felt how inside me the last thin thread connecting me with that obedient, beaten, eternally guilty girl I was just some pathetic half-hour ago was finally breaking and snapping. All previous protective shell completely shed. Only pure, icy, crystal rage remained inside. At that very moment, in the absolute silence of the apartment, a sharp metallic sound rang out. The lock clicked quietly, almost silently, in the front door. Lubricated hinges creaked heavily. Someone entered the hallway, breathing heavily and noisily. "Sierra? Are you home? Are you back from university already?" The tired, broken to the limit, frightened voice of Franklin rang out in the suddenly frozen, ringing silence of our huge apartment. His footsteps sounded extremely uncertain, shuffling and heavy in the spacious hallway. He rounded the corner of the semi-dark space and suddenly froze in his tracks, right at the entrance to the pantry area. He looked inside and immediately saw me, pale as death, with scratched fingers, feverishly shining eyes from tears, and the ill-fated envelope with a cracked sealing wax seal clasped in numb hands. For a fraction of a second, in his faded eyes, washed out by time and endless fear, there flashed not sincere surprise at my finding here, but dull, absolutely doomed exhaustion of a person whose multi-year, carefully hidden nightmare had finally materialized in reality, breaking through all protective barriers. "Oh, I see you found it after all," the father said dully, emotionlessly, like a robot, lowering his right hand, in which car keys hung listlessly. They fell onto the polished wooden cabinet with a ringing, sharp metallic thud, breaking the dead silence. I slowly, with incredible effort, raised my inflamed eyes to him, in which a boiling, suffocating mixture of primitive rage, bitter despair, and unbearable realization that my entire past life was built on a fundamental, monstrous lie was raging furiously. "You knew!" My voice sounded alien, hoarse, completely dried out by tears and screams. "You knew all this time, Franklin. You knew from day one that I'm not your real daughter. You knew she coldly stole me from the hospital. You knew she methodically destroyed that family, broke their lives, took their second son away. And all these years you silently covered up her crimes? How could you even live with this heavy burden on your conscience? How could you look me in the eye calmly every year on my birthday and let her mock me, making me feel guilty for her misfortunes?" Franklin, guiltily, animal-like, stepped half a step back, heavily leaning his shoulder against the cold wooden jamb. He took a deep, convulsive breath, covering his face with wrinkled, scratched palms, and for a moment, it seemed to me as if this frail old man had aged 10 years right before my eyes, under the weight of the collapsed truth. "You understand absolutely nothing about this complicated life, Sierra." He spoke in a muffled, trembling whisper that oozed desperate, pathetic, cowardly self-justification. Gwendolyn was completely out of her mind after the terrible, sudden death of our own child. She lost her mind from grief. Her mind became clouded forever. She was delirious for weeks. When she brought you into our house, it was terrible, unthinkable madness. But I loved her madly, and then very quickly got attached to you yourself as my own. You were such an angelic, quiet child. And when those unfortunate people appeared on the threshold of our house, I wanted to run to the police immediately. Honestly, I did. But Gwendolyn, she showed me her diabolical plan on time. She told me straight that if I blurted out even a single word to law enforcement, she would immediately accuse me of complicity in infant abduction, completely ruin our life, and make sure I never saw you in my life again. She is a master of psychological manipulation, Sierra. She masterfully held us both hostage in this cursed house for many years. "Hostage!" I shrieked, abruptly jumping to my feet with a stack of incriminating documents in my hands. "You were an adult, capable man. You calmly allowed her to destroy the lives of completely innocent people. You allowed her to turn my entire childhood into a real hell on earth, making me believe that I was to blame for everything. And you're trying to call this banal hostage-taking? Both of you are cold-blooded monsters!" At that very moment, a mobile phone rang sharply, insistently, and loudly in the pocket of Father's jacket. Franklin flinched in surprise, pulled the device out with trembling fingers, and looked in fright at the glowing screen. The name flashed clearly on the display. Gwendolyn. She was calling from a ward in the city hospital. Judging by everything, the cunning mother either persuaded the doctors to let her go ahead of schedule or simply wrote an official refusal of hospitalization on her own, intuitively feeling that the card house she had been meticulously building for 3 decades was now rapidly collapsing. "Give me that phone!" I snatched the device from his weak hands with a wild scream and activated the speakerphone with a trembling finger. The familiar, cold, commanding, absolutely smooth voice of my mother immediately came through the speaker, sending chills running down my body. "Franklin, why are you silent into the phone? Have you found her yet? I told you black on white before leaving. There was no need to leave that damned box on the mezzanine in easy reach." I knew from the start that sooner or later she would have the brains and impudence to look in there. But since it happened, let her listen to me. "Sierra, my dear girl, you are standing right there next to him, I know perfectly well." "Well, did it finally dawn on you why I hated your birthday so fiercely? Because every year on this date, I cried not from some mythical grief, but from sticky, animal terror of losing you forever. I gave you all my youth, all my life. I protected you day and night from those worthless marginals who would have left you to the mercy of fate in poverty. And you are standing here now and daring to yell at your father instead of falling at my feet and saying a banal thank you for growing up in luxury and safety, and not in a pigsty with those drunks. "You stole me from the hospital!" I screamed into the dead phone speaker, feeling burning tears of impotence flood my face. "You ruined the life of my real family! You are a shameless monster, Gwendolyn." "I am your only mother!" The voice from the speaker instantly broke into a piercing screech full of pure madness. "I am the woman who raised you, who made a human being out of you. And if you dare to take even a single step out of this house right now to meet those imposters, you will bitterly regret it for the rest of your days. I will find a way to destroy you just as easily and ruthlessly as I destroyed them back then." I hurled the phone violently against the floor of the entrance area. The plastic body of the device shattered into small fragments under a powerful impact against the tile. Franklin pressed his back against the wall, looking at me in fright with wild eyes. I didn't waste another second on his pathetic excuses or Mom's insane threats. I sharply turned around, ran out of the apartment onto the stairwell, slamming the door behind me with such force that the window panes rattled in the hallway. A thick folder with all collected documents and old photographs remained in my hands. I knew the address for sure. I knew where to look for those people whose destiny was destroyed by the woman I had mistakenly called my mother for a quarter of a century. The long, exhausting car ride to the remote, deaf and lost among picturesque hills and thick centuries-old forests suburban dacha district took me exactly 3 long, viscous hours, filled to the limit with feverish thoughts and fears. I drove the car as if on autopilot, mechanically shifting gears and clutching the leather steering wheel with white, numb fingers from colossal nervous tension, while fragments of Mom's scary letters, her hysterical, insane cries from the broken phone speaker, and the frightened, pathetic, wrinkled face of my father, left completely alone in an empty, echoing apartment, spun like a continuous, terrifying-to-shiver film strip before my inner eyes. My brain was literally melting from colossal information overload, desperately trying to assimilate that monstrous, unbearable volume of truth that had descended upon me in an avalanche over this cursed day. But deep inside, a strange, ringing, crystal-clear feeling of long-awaited liberation was growing. For the first time in my long, restricted 25-year life, I was committing an act solely of my own free will, rather than obeying the unspoken, tyrannical rules of someone else's deep mental disorder. The navigator in the car's dashboard confidently led me to a quiet, cozy provincial sector where neat, single-story houses were buried in the thick greenery of old spreading apple trees, cherry orchards, and blooming front gardens. That exact address indicated on the back of one of the faded, battered children's photographs in the stolen archive envelope led me to the gates of house number 42. White plastic siding on the facade, an ideally groomed emerald lawn, flower beds with bright red and yellow petunias, and homemade wooden swings on a spacious porch flooded with soft sunset sun. There was no hint whatsoever of the showy, oppressive luxury of our gloomy city mansion, but this simple place breathed such incredible healing warmth, mental tranquility, and authenticity that I had never felt within my parental walls in all my conscious life. I abruptly killed the engine, turned off the ignition, and sat in the car cabin for a few minutes in complete stillness, greedily and fearfully peering into the facade of this unfamiliar, but for some reason instinctively native house. My fingers continued to tremble heavily, barely allowing me to unbuckle the seatbelt, and my breathing was ragged, heavy, and hot. What exactly will I say to them upon our very first meeting? With what words to start this insane, incredible dialogue? Hello, I am that baby girl kidnapped from the hospital 30 years ago because of whom your whole life turned into ruins. How will they react in general to the sudden appearance of an adult, unfamiliar person on their doorstep? What if they just chase me away with a broom, mistaking me for a crazy swindler, or yet another dirty, sophisticated psychological provocation on the part of that crazy woman who methodically broke their life? Taking a deep, trembling breath and gathering the remnants of my self-control piece by piece, I resolutely pushed myself out of the car cabin, walked along the creaky gravel path, and climbed the wooden steps onto the porch. There was no familiar electric doorbell at the front door. Instead, an old copper bell on a braided silk cord hung right by the wooden jamb. Nervously, with a sinking heart and icy fingers, I pulled the string. A melodious, clean, silvery chime rang out over the quiet evening street, echoing heavily in my chest. Behind the massive wooden door, hurried, shuffling steps were immediately heard. First, heavier, men's steps, and following them, light, scuffling women's steps. The door handle smoothly turned downward, the lock clicked quietly, and a woman appeared on the threshold. She looked about 55 years old, with soft facial features scarred by deep wrinkles, graying hair carelessly and simply gathered into a ponytail, and incredibly deep, sad, dark chocolate eyes in which eternal sorrow froze. When she looked at me intently, her face first expressed the most ordinary, polite surprise at the visit of an unexpected stranger at this late hour. But then her gaze accidentally slid across my open forehead and dropped sharply to my neck and left shoulder. The woman instantly staggered backward, barely falling from the rush of weakness, and convulsively grasped both hands onto the wooden door jamb for support. Her breath broke off whistling halfway, and her eyes widened in wild shock and disbelief. "Oh my God! Almighty!" she exhaled with her bleached, parched lips, and hot, uncontrolled tears immediately gushed down her cheeks like a waterfall. "Quentin! Quentin, for God's sake, come here! Come here quickly, look!" From the depths of the dark corridor of the house came a troubled, tense man's voice. "What happened there, Heather? Who came this time? Who else did the devil bring?" Literally a second later, a tall, gray-haired man with tired eyes and deep furrows of wrinkles around his mouth stepped quickly into the hallway. He looked confusedly at his weeping wife, then shifted a frightened look at me, and froze in his tracks, dropping a porcelain cup of unfinished coffee from his weakened hands with a ringing crash that shattered into smithereens on the tiled floor. "This birthmark," the man whispered, taking an uncertain, staggering step forward and convulsively stretching out a trembling, calloused palm toward me. On his left forearm, the exact same old scar was clearly visible, and on my open shoulder flaunted that very unique pinkish sign in the form of a crescent, the secret of which I didn't understand my whole conscious life. On the left shoulder, Sierra? God, Emily? They called me Sierra for many years. I forced out through a choking spasm approaching my throat, feeling the thin dam inside me finally collapse and hot tears flooding my face. But I found that envelope in the attic. I know absolutely the whole truth about Gwendolyn. I know that you searched for me for 25 long years. They didn't ask any unnecessary questions, demand documents, or doubt. Heather simply rushed forward with a breaking cry and wrapped me in such tight, suffocating native embraces as if she were panically afraid I would disappear again, dissolving into the air like morning fog. Quentin awkwardly hugged us both, covering his face with wrinkled hands, and the old man cried openly, completely unashamed of his tears and despair. We stood like that in the middle of the hallway for several long, sacred minutes, while the last crimson rays of the setting sun fell outside the window, erasing the boundaries of our divided past. Returning to that gloomy, falsity and tyranny-soaked house on the edge of town was something I never did again under any pretext or for any treasures in the world. All my personal belongings, university textbooks, memorable trifles, and documents were carefully collected for me by investigators accompanied by my real blood parents when we finally, officially, without fear or doubt, applied to the Prosecutor General's office with a detailed statement. We backed it up with that very irrefutable archive envelope containing Gwendolyn's confession, old receipts for bribing corrupt officials, and a full package of evidence proving her guilt. When a police operational group and special forces fighters suddenly raided our old mansion early in the morning, Gwendolyn tried until the very last second to play her trump card, honed over decades of manipulation, of a terminally ill, unhappy, and infirm woman. She staged a cynical, showy tantrum right in front of the investigators, shrieked across the house, fell to her knees, wrung her hands, and accused everyone around of black ingratitude and betrayal. But this time, her sophisticated psychological tricks, crocodile tears, and feigned attacks completely failed against the letter of the law. Heavy criminal cases under several articles of the Criminal Code were officially opened against her. Kidnapping of a minor in especially large scale, systematic forgery of official documents, giving knowingly false testimony, and intentional, cynical fabrication of fake evidence with the aim of destroying an innocent family. Under concrete pressure from evidence, Franklin wrote a detailed plea deal and an official refusal to further cover up her criminal acts, sincerely hoping, at least in this pathetic way, to redeem a tiny part of his colossal guilt before the past. The trial was long, exhausting, but absolutely fair. The main outcome of this story came to pass. Gwendolyn got what she deserved and was sentenced by the court to a real, harsh, and lengthy prison term in a strict regime colony. None of her highly paid lawyers and unsuccessful attempts to convince the Forensic Psychiatric Commission that she was allegedly guided exclusively by maternal feelings helped soften the sentence. The judge clearly and unequivocally stated in his final speech, "A crime of such monstrous, calculated cruelty that destroyed two happy families to the ground to satisfy a selfish whim has no statute of limitations and can never be justified by any blind love." My younger brother, whom the state punitive machine once unfairly and cruelly removed from the family based on Gwendolyn's fabricated accusations, I have already visited several times. We talked for many hours, and although both of us still have to go through a long path of psychological rehabilitation and rebuild the family bridges lost over the years of separation, that strong, unbreakable blood bond that decades of someone else's lies could not destroy instantly arose between us. We talked for hours, as if trying desperately to make up for those thousands of missed days that were cynically and ruthlessly stolen from us. I talked in detail, with a trembling voice, tears in my eyes, and clenched fists, about everything regarding my strange, isolated childhood. About the golden cage where I was raised, about those crazy, enslaving rules that Gwendolyn established daily, about her icy, empty, frightening eyes every time the ill-fated August 12th arrived on the calendar, and about that scary box in the attic that turned my entire familiar universe upside down in a single instant. I showed them the evidence found, yellowed envelopes, clippings from old newspapers describing the whole hell they went through the direct fault of my adoptive mother in dry, official language. Listening to my scary stories, Quentin clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white, and Heather silently cried, covering her mouth with her palm. But there was no longer the former destructive hopelessness in these tears. It was long-awaited cleansing, the final chord of a monstrous drama. Heather and Quentin helped me go through all the bureaucratic circles of restoring my true identity. I officially reclaimed my real birth name, Emily, although getting used to it after so many years of living under a false name turned out to be difficult. That very strange scar birthmark on my left shoulder no longer causes me complexes or pain. Now it is just a living, tangible reminder of the resilience and incredible spirit of people who never, not for a minute, gave up looking for their child. For the first time in my life, August 12th ceased to be a day of mourning, loneliness, and suffocating fear. This year, as a big, friendly family, We sat on the sun-drenched veranda of that very cozy suburban cottage under spreading apple trees, ate a holiday pie with candles, and when I blew them out with one light breath, I made only one cherished wish: that never again on this earth should any child grow up with a heavy, imposed sense of guilt just for being born. And what do you think, dear readers? Is it fair that Gwendolyn will spend long years behind bars for the ruined destinies of two families at once? Or does she deserve a much harsher punishment for everything done? Be sure to write your opinion in the comments. This story has come to an end, but the darkness still holds many secrets. If you want to be the first to learn about new secrets and human destinies, give a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and become part of our Storytime drama community. See you in the new video!